Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn. Today I want to introduce you to a legal not-for-profit doing vital work in Canada. It's called Innocence Canada, and its mandate is to identify, advocate for, and exonerate individuals who have been convicted of a crime they did not commit. Innocence Canada works in the courts and also engages in legal education and advocates for reform. Since it was founded in 1993, Innocence Canada's team of volunteer lawyers has reviewed hundreds of cases, leading to the exoneration of 24 innocent people who together have spent more than 200 years in prison for crimes they didn't commit. Here today to discuss the work of Innocence Canada is Crow President Ron Dalton, who is also an exonerated person, and Pamels Glatt. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Ron, you yourself are an exonerated person. What can you tell us about your story?
The Reader's Digest version of my story is I was convicted for a crime that did not happen in 1989. I spent 8.5 years in a maximum security prison. My conviction was overturned. I was retried and ultimately acquitted in the year 2000. I've been out of prison now for 25 years, and as soon as my acquittal was processed in 2000, 23 years ago almost now, I started looking around for ways to give back and help out other individuals like myself. I knew I was not the only person that had gone through this experience. By that point in time, we were aware of cases like Donald Marshall Jr.'s, David Milgaard, Stephen Truscott, and some of the other better known cases. And when I looked around the country, there was only one organization doing this type of work on a national basis, and that was what we used to call AIDWC, the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, which was just an earlier name for Innocence Canada.
Now, you named a few of cases that some Canadians might be familiar with, like David Milgaard, Stephen Truscott. Pam, what can you tell us at a high level about some of those cases, some cases that Innocence Canada worked on, because those were both cases that Innocence Canada worked on and achieved exonerations in?
I'm actually going to let Ron take this one.
Pam and I kind of went down your list of questions and decided who was going to answer what before we got to you. Mostly because I was around longer than Pam has been with the organization. The first case that the individuals who started this organization worked on was the Guy Paul Moran case. And Guy Paul Moran was convicted of the murder of a neighboring child. And we had volunteer lawyers and lay people who rallied around him and his family and worked to help exonerate him. And when he was cleared, they looked around at each other and said, you know, I bet there's a lot more of these cases than this one. And they had the bug for fighting the injustice then, and they formed a nonprofit organization and have been working for the last 30 years to create the organization that we have now. We started out as a group of volunteer do-gooders trying to help this one case, but we expanded into a more formal nonprofit organization.
You know, I want to know sort of generally, what types of things, Pam, lead to wrongful convictions? How common is it to see a wrongful conviction because of, for example, police misconduct, because of experts or the prosecution, compared to things like straight up errors or mistaken identity?
That's a great question, because, you know, it's not just one of these, contributing factors that lead to wrongful convictions. You know, most of the time it's, all of these compounding one another. So you don't just see police misconduct or, a forensic error or tunnel vision or eyewitness misidentification, on their own independently of each other. You have all of these or some of these or many of these all happening at once, and together they really create the perfect storm. And that's what makes it so difficult to identify wrongful convictions and, to get these cases reopened, because you have to come at it from multiple angles.
When you just briefly, when you say tunnel vision, what in 20 seconds or so, what are you referring to there?
Yeah, so tunnel vision is, focusing on, a specific suspect or a specific theory and making the evidence fit that theory rather than going with the evidence and, coming up with a theory based on that.
Yeah. We've got to go to commercial break now, but when we come back, I want to discuss more about this topic of wrongful convictions and the role of Innocence Canada. Welcome back to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and we're discussing the work of Innocence Canada to exonerate wrongfully convicted people. Now, Ron, I saw the shirt that you were wearing. I don't know if our viewers can see it. I think it says, "It happened to me, it could happen to you." Do you want to show us for a second what it?
That's exactly what it says. I didn't dress down purposely because this is a Friday. I threw this on because every year I was going to use the word celebrate, but that's not the right word. We recognize Wrongful Conviction Day in the first week of October, sometime usually around the 2nd of October. It's something that our organization started and it has spread worldwide. And we've hosted a number of conferences, and we usually have T-shirts with slogans. But this one I've had for a number of years. But it's our basic message when we're speaking to the public as we are today. For people who have never heard of us, if they take nothing else away from our discussion today, it should be the message that this is something that happened to me, but it can happen to anyone.
Yeah, I think what we want to get to is, I think a lot of Canadians will think this is something that is rare. It's something that doesn't happen a lot. But what key takeaway do you want people to have about why we should care about wrongful convictions, and maybe even the damage they do to the integrity of our justice system?
Yeah, I think it's a broader issue. We tend to say the justice system as if it's a third party, but the justice system is an arm of a government, and we are the government. The people of Canada deserve a system that works, a system that we can have faith in, and common sense will tell us, and the 50 years of experience of working in this field tells us that our justice system is made of human beings, and human beings make mistakes. Unfortunately, the Canadian Criminal Code has no provisions in it for correcting those mistakes or adjusting or compensating people for errors when they are made. And that's why the nonprofit organization that we represent has come into being. So you should know that there's only a nonprofit organization made up of a bunch of volunteers and some small paid staff at this point, standing between the justice minister and the mechanism of the Canadian justice system and an accused person. And if they get it wrong, you better hope that there's an organization like ours around to try and sort it out. Now, part of the work that we do is education and outreach, and Pam leads that arm of our operation. We work with universities and schools and churches and anybody who will listen to us, including yourself and your audience today, just to get the word out there that this does happen. It's still relatively rare, thank goodness, but it's much more common than we used to think it was.
Pam, Ron mentioned something there that I want to pick up on, which is what happens when someone is exonerated, and the lack of provisions in the criminal code to deal with it, and the lack of a legislative structure to deal with wrongful convictions. What can you tell us about, the compensation system for people who have been victimized by some type of misconduct or a miscarriage of justice that led to a wrongful conviction?
Totally. So in Canada, compensation isn't automatic, and there isn't a framework, necessarily to deal with compensation. In the U.S., some states do have legislation around compensation, but, in Canada, it's often taken on a case-by-case basis. And I'll let Ron expand on that if he wants to add to that.
Yeah, sure, Ron.
Well, the fact of the matter is that we've had over 40 exonerations in homicide cases in this country, and fewer than half of those people have ever been compensated for the ordeal that they've gone through. There is no mechanism in the criminal code to compensate wrongly convicted people because they never contemplated that they would make mistakes. Now, gradually, we're starting to recognize that phenomenon, and we lobby continuously for improved legislation. But the bottom line is individuals like myself who have been wrongfully convicted are left to rely on civil procedures. We can sue the players involved, and we've had some success going through public inquiries. There's been 7 public inquiries in the last 35 years looking into wrongful convictions, starting with the Donald Marshall Jr. one in Nova Scotia. And those public inquiries have most often recommended compensating the victims, the people who were wrongly convicted. But it's a very hit and miss system. There is no guaranteed mechanism, and it's very time consuming. I spent 8.5 years in prison. I spent another 7 years after I was exonerated in civil proceedings, and I went through a public inquiry looking into my case and a couple of other individuals in the same jurisdiction before I received any kind of compensation for not only I went through, but my family and others as well.
Wow. We've got to go to commercial break, but we're going to continue this conversation when we come back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we are discussing the work of Innocence Canada, a legal not-for-profit that works to exonerate the wrongfully convicted. Now, Ron, what types of cases does Innocence Canada take, and how do they get to your doorstep? How do you find them?
The type of cases, first off, are homicide cases. With a very rare exception, we may look at something peripheral, but we have very limited resources as a nonprofit, so we've tackled the most serious wrongful convictions in the system, which are those of homicide cases. Cases come to us either directly from the individual who's been convicted. Sometimes their lawyers or their family members have heard to us. We reach out into prisons, and to some extent, we've been the victim of our own success. By doing that, we currently have over 100 cases that we're working on. Half of those we're working on actively, and the other half are on a wait list because of our limited resources till we can get to them.
And who does, I mean, you're talking about your limited resources, so who does the legal work in the cases? And are these volunteer lawyers, or do you have staff lawyers?
Both. And 30 years ago when we started out, it was strictly volunteers. We were 5 or 6 years into operation before we could even pay one staff member, and that was somebody to look after the office. Currently, though, we have half a dozen staff lawyers and volunteer lawyers and people that are on our board. Some of them were founding members of the organization, all working on these cases. And we have lawyers who volunteer just to review cases and make recommendations. We get a case, sometimes they're going back 20 or 30 years. They come in the form of 20 or 30 banker's boxes of information, some of which is missing, disclosure that was never received. It's quite an ordeal. We're currently working on a case that is 39 and a half years old.
Wow.
And it involves 2 wrongly convicted individuals. And I worked on that case, helping these 2 individuals 35 years ago when I was in the same prison as they were.
So if you're working on cases that are that old, and in homicide the parole eligibility is 20 years, are you finding more that you are dealing with cases after a person has already been released on parole, or are they usually still in prison when you're dealing with them, or is it both?
Just for clarification, it is both. Generally, we get involved while the person is still incarcerated. But when you say released from parole, these people are all serving life sentences. So whether they're serving them in a penitentiary or in the community, they're not released from parole until they actually die. So we have people who have been incarcerated for 20 or 25 years, and we worked on their case for another 10 or 15 years while they're out in the community, but they're still serving a sentence. They're still subject to the wants and the whims of a parole system.
And not just the parole system, Ron. It's the the stigma of being convicted of a crime, of homicide. And in these cases, it's a homicide they didn't actually commit. So what types of consequences are there for people, in addition to parole, who are living under this shadow of a wrongful conviction before they've been exonerated?
Yes, we've been talking about the court system, but there's also the court of public opinion. These people are always looked at as convicted murderers, and until we get their convictions overturned, that's their legal status, whether they're in prison or in the community. They are still convicted murderers. And in some instances, and David Milgaard's was a good example, David spent 23 years in prison, another 7 years on parole before we got him exonerated. But in exonerating David, in one of the first DNA cases in this country, we were also able to identify Larry Fisher as the perpetrator of the crime. So not only is the damage done to the individual and the individual's family who was wrongly convicted, but we've let a dangerous person in the Milgard case. Larry Fisher was on the go for 30 years after he killed Gail Miller.
And was he prosecuted? Did he end up being prosecuted?
He ended up taking a plea to second-degree murder, and he's died in prison since. But there was 30 years in between the time that he killed Gail Miller and when we finally caught up to him through DNA, and that was secondary to the work that we do. But that's happened in a couple of cases. That in exonerating the wrong person, we've actually been able to identify the correct one.
Pam, we've only got 30 seconds left, but how can people support the work of Innocence Canada if they want to do that?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, the easiest way is to educate yourself on wrongful convictions and that this happens. Educate yourself on your rights. Innocence Canada is a registered charity for taxation purposes, and we're always so grateful for any donations. That's, what helps us do the work that we do. And, as Ron mentioned earlier, we do, educational trainings, presentations.
We've got to go to break, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the work of Innocence Canada in exonerating wrongfully convicted people. Ron, what are some of the biggest challenges in getting convictions overturned in cases of wrongful convictions?
In many of the cases that we look at, time is one of the biggest challenges. We've had cases go back, starting with the Stephen Truscott case, that went back 48 years when we were working on it. You don't have the disclosure from the old days. Most exhibits have been destroyed. Witnesses, individuals who are involved in the case are no longer living. So time is a big problem going back. But the Crown culture, our lead lawyer tends to refer to that quite often. At one time, the Crown, the police, and the Crown prosecutors were not in the habit of sharing the information they had with the accused person. And that's gradually changed as our charter came into force in the 80s, and for the last 25 years it's been getting better. But we're still challenged with that when we go back to look at older cases.
Now, that case you mentioned, Stephen Truscott, that's a name some Canadians might be familiar with. It's a very famous case of wrongful conviction and miscarriage of justice. Can you give us at a high level a description of what happened in that case?
Stephen Truscott was 14 years old in 1959 when he was convicted for the murder of his 12-year-old classmate. He was sentenced to hang for that crime, and the only reason he didn't is the public, and largely women across the country, started writing the Prime Minister and the federal cabinet saying you can't hang a 14-year-old no matter what he may have done. They didn't question the veracity of his conviction and whether he was guilty of this homicide. They just made a political decision that it wasn't a good idea to hang a 14-year-old kid. And he served 10 years in prison. He was on parole for another 35 years before we started working on his case. He got married, raised a family, and eventually we were able to prove his innocence, and he was acquitted 48 or 49 years after the fact. But that was a case that was a stain on the collective conscience of our country. We almost hung an innocent 14-year-old child.
And if I'm not mistaken, his case was pivotal in Canada getting rid of the death penalty. Is that right?
It was certainly discussed at the time. We didn't get rid of the death penalty until 1976. And there was a lot of discussion around his case. But he was still considered guilty at the time. They just used it as an example of what a harsh punishment it would be to sentence a 14-year-old child to hang.
And did they ever find who had committed the crime in his case?
They had a couple of good suspects, but 50 years after the fact, the best suspects were no longer alive. Most of the witnesses weren't, so it's still an unsolved crime. We do know that Stephen Truscott was innocent, but we were never able to identify the actual perpetrator. And
went on to play a very productive role in society and have a family and a job.
He certainly did, yeah. Very, very patriotic gentleman, actually. Very, very inspiring. It's a story that all Canadians should know. And I can remember reading a book about it when I was 14 or 15 years old, which was a few years ago. And my mother, we were living in Ontario at the time this happened. And my mother remembers the case quite well.
Now, a lot of these cases, these 24 cases that Innocence Canada has achieved exonerations on, are on your website, where people can learn a lot more about it. Pam, what can you tell us? Where can people go to learn more information?
Yeah, definitely. So our website is www.innocencecanada.com, and we have all of our exonerees on our website, so you can read a bit more about them. Yeah.
And if people want to make a donation to the work that you do, because you do rely on charitable donations, can they do that through the website as well?
Yeah, you can reach, oh, sorry, Ron, you go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, you go, Ron, it's okay.
We can definitely be reached through the website, yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you both for the work that you do. This is really important work for our justice system. It's also fascinating to read about these cases. So I encourage everyone to check out the website and learn more about the really vital work that Innocence Canada does. So thank you both so much for your work and for coming on today to share it with me.
Thank you.
Thank you and your viewers.
Today we've heard about the work of Innocence Canada, advocating for people who have been convicted of a crime they didn't commit. Innocence Canada is doing some of the most important legal work in our justice system. The integrity of our system depends on preventing and correcting the conviction of innocent people. Are reforms needed to prevent these types of miscarriage of justice? You be the judge. I'm Christine, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.